She stands 305 feet tall, torch raised to the sky, but almost no one wanted to pay for her. The French dreamed her up. The Americans nearly turned her down, and the man who built her spine would later conquer the sky itself. This is the story they never taught you in school. The desperate deals, the broken promises, and the one newspaper editor who saved Lady Liberty from being melted down before she ever reached New York Harbor. If history hits different when it's told right, hit subscribe and ring that bell. New stories drop every week on History for Sleep, perfect for winding down or diving deep. It is the summer of 1865, and France is tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long day's work or even from the exhaustion of war. Though France had known plenty of both, this was a deeper fatigue, the kind that settles into the bones of a nation when its people have spent years watching freedom discussed, promised, debated, and then quietly folded away like a letter that was never meant to be sent. The Second Empire under Napoleon III had seen to that. The press was muzzled. Political opposition was managed, suppressed, or exiled. The great republican ideals that had once set Europe trembling, liberté, égalité, fraternité, had been reduced in practical terms to decorative words on public buildings, while the man in power governed with the habits of a monarch dressed in the costume of a modern statesman. And yet France still had its dinner parties. In a country where open political speech could carry consequences, the dinner table became something sacred, a space where candlelight softened the edges of dangerous ideas, and where wine gave courage to the kinds of conversations that newspapers could no longer print. The French intellectual class had perfected the art of the gathered evening. It was how ideas survived. It was how hope moved quietly from one mind to another, traveling through the warm air of a private dining room instead of the cold columns of a censored press. It was into one of these evenings that the idea of the Statue of Liberty was born. The house belonged to Edouard de la Boulaye, and if you had to design a man perfectly suited to plant this particular seed in this particular moment, you could not have done better. La Boulaye was a legal scholar, a professor at the Collège de France, and one of the foremost authorities on American history and constitutional law in all of Europe. He had spent decades studying the United States with a devotion that went far beyond academic interest. For La Boulaye, America was not simply a country across the ocean. It was a living proof of concept, evidence that a republic built on genuine democratic ideals could not only exist, but endure. He had written about it extensively, translated American political text into French, and lectured on the subject with an enthusiasm that his students found either infectious or exhausting, depending on their patience for constitutional theory. He was a man in love with an idea, and the idea was this: that freedom was not a gift governments granted to their people. It was something the people claimed for themselves, built institutions around, and defended, not with sentiment, but with law. In France in 1865, that idea was quietly revolutionary. The guests who gathered at his table that evening were men of similar minds. Lawyers, writers, artists, academics, the kind of educated Frenchmen who could speak fluently about the American Civil War and what its conclusion meant for the future of democratic governance worldwide. The war had just ended. Lincoln had been assassinated only weeks or months before, depending on the exact timing of the dinner. The date has been softened by history, remembered more for what it produced than for the precise calendar square it occupied. The mood, in any case, was one of mingled grief and cautious triumph. The Union had held. Slavery had been legally abolished. A republic built on democratic principles had survived the most severe internal fracture imaginable, and had emerged, battered but intact, on the other side. To men like La Boulaye, this was almost unbearably moving. He had watched from across the Atlantic with the particular anguish of someone who believes deeply in a cause he cannot directly fight. France had not officially entered the war, though sympathy had run in complicated directions. Napoleon III's government had at times shown interest in a Confederate victory, which would have served French imperial ambitions in the Americas. But French Republicans, the liberal intellectuals and democratic thinkers, had felt the Union cause in their bones. They understood instinctively that the American experiment and the French Republican tradition were not separate stories. They were chapters in the same book written in different languages. The American Revolution had been, in no small part, spiritually fueled by French Enlightenment philosophy, and the French Revolution had drawn its boldest energy from the example of Americans who had actually done it, who had looked at an unjust government and said, with remarkable clarity, no. Now, at the dinner table, with the candles burning low, and the conversation circling through the events of the past months, Laboulaye said something that changed the direction of the evening. The precise words are lost, as the precise words of private dinners always are, but the idea reconstructed from accounts and correspondence went something like this. Would it not be a magnificent thing, he proposed, if the people of France were to give the people of America a monument to mark the friendship between their two nations, something grand enough to honor the ideals they shared, something that would stand as a symbol of what free people could build together. Not a gift from one government to another, he was careful to say, not a diplomatic gesture between heads of state, a gift from the French people to the American people, from one republic to another. The room must have paused, in a country where the government controlled the press, in a country where the government controlled the press, where political organizations required official approval, where the word republic itself was spoken with a certain careful quietness in some circles. The proposition carried a second meaning that everyone at the table would have understood immediately. A monument to liberty, paid for by French citizens, celebrating American democracy. This was not simply an artistic project, it was a statement. It was a way of saying, in stone and copper in symbolic grandeur, what French Republicans could not say plainly in public, that they believed in something different from what they currently had, that they had not forgotten what France had once stood for and could stand for again, that the ideals of 1789 were not dead, they were simply waiting. Among the guests that evening was a young sculptor named Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi. He was in his late 20s, already ambitious, already burning with the particular hunger of an artist who knows he is capable of something monumental and has not yet found the right monumental thing to do. He had grown up in Alsace, in the northeastern reaches of France, in a region with its own complicated relationship to identity and belonging. He had studied in Paris, traveled to Egypt, been dazzled by the colossal scale of ancient monuments, the Sphinx, the temples of Abu Simbel, the vast stone figures that seemed to have been built not for human eyes, but for eternity itself. He had come away from that journey with a conviction that scale was not merely a technical consideration in sculpture. Scale was meaning. The bigger the form, the more permanent the statement. He listened that evening with the focused attention of someone who recognizes, on some primal level, that he is hearing the description of his own destiny. The conversation moved on, as dinner conversations do, into the wine, into the evening, into the comfortable dispersal of men returning home through lamplit streets, but the idea did not disperse. For Laboulaye, it lodged itself somewhere between hope and purpose. For Bartholdi, it lit something that would not go out for the next 20 years. What is important to understand, and what tends to get lost in the more triumphant retellings of this story, is how genuinely uncertain everything was in that room. There was no plan, there was no funding, there was no agreement with the American government, no site selected, no engineering solution identified for how one would actually build a statue large enough to be visible from ships at sea. There was only a feeling, and a feeling held by men living under a government that would have had complicated reactions to a monument explicitly linking French citizens to the cause of Republican liberty. France was not a free country in 1865. That sentence sounds strange when applied to France, a nation that has given the world some of its most enduring language about liberty. But the France of Napoleon III was a surveillance state in the vocabulary of its era. Not the technological surveillance of later centuries, but the humankind, the network of informants and official scrutiny and carefully managed public life that autocratic governments have always constructed around themselves. Laboulaye was a prominent figure, somewhat protected by his academic reputation, but he was not untouchable. His Republican sympathies were well known and had cost him professionally at various points. The idea of organizing a public campaign around a monument to American liberty was not something that could be done openly, loudly, and without consequence under the current regime. So it waited. This is part of the story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The years of patient waiting that followed that dinner, the long, quiet period during which the idea existed mainly as a private conviction held by a small circle of like-minded men who understood that the timing was not yet right. Laboulaye did not abandon the idea. He returned to it in correspondence, in private conversation, in the patient way that people who have committed themselves to something larger than the present moment learn to wait. He was playing a long game. He was playing a long game, as French Republicans had been playing a long game for decades, convinced that history was moving in their direction, willing to work within the constraints of the present while keeping their eyes on a different future. What he could not have fully predicted was that the future would arrive faster than expected, and through catastrophe. In 1870, France went to war with Prussia, and the war was a disaster of staggering proportions. Napoleon III was captured at the Battle of Sedan. The Second Empire collapsed almost overnight. The Prussians besieged Paris, and in the wreckage and humiliation that followed, the terrible winter siege, the fall of the capital, the brutal suppression of the Paris Commune in the spring of 1871, the French Third Republic was born. It was born fragile, contested, uncertain of its own survival. But it was, at least in theory, a republic. The word could be spoken again without quite the same political risk. Le Boulier's moment had arrived, or something close to it. He moved quickly. He gathered the small circle of believers he had been illegally cultivating since that dinner 6 years earlier. He began organizing what would become the Franco-American Union, the fundraising body that would eventually finance the statue on the French side. And he sent Bartholdi to America. This was a remarkable act of faith, considering that in 1871 the statue was still entirely imaginary. There were sketches, there was a concept, there was the burning conviction of one idealistic sculptor and one scholarly professor that a great monument to liberty could and should be built. But there was nothing else, no formal agreement, no promised American pedestal, no confirmed site, no timeline, no money. Bartholdi sailed to the United States carrying little more than his passion and a set of letters of introduction to prominent Americans that Laboulaye had carefully arranged. What drove him beyond personal ambition was something that the dinner at Le Boulier's house had installed in him as firmly as a conviction installs itself in a young man who hears the right idea at the right moment in his life. Bartholdi believed, and this belief would sustain him through decades of frustration, financial crisis, political complications, and engineering challenges that would have broken a less determined man, that he was building something eternal, not just a statue, not just a diplomatic gesture, something that would stand at the gateway of the new world and speak across time to everyone who saw it about what human beings were capable of when they organized themselves around the right ideas. The dinner at Le Boulier's table had been, on the surface, an ordinary evening, candlelight, wine, conversation among educated men who shared a political philosophy and a frustration with the government they lived under. Nothing was signed, nothing was decided. The guests went home, the candles were snuffed out, the servants cleared the dishes, but fitting somewhere at that table, something had been lit that was not going out. An image was forming slowly and with the patience that great visions require. Something enormous, something copper bright, something enormous, something copper bright, something holding a torch against the sky above the water of a harbor he had not yet seen, in a country that had not yet agreed to receive her. She was not yet even a dream, really. She was the ghost of one, the impression left by a single evening's conversation, drifting through the imagination of a man with the talent and the stubbornness to eventually make her real. And that, of all the unlikely origins of all the unlikely monuments in the world, may be the most quietly astonishing thing about her. She began not with a decree, not with a commission, not with the signature of presidents or kings. She began with dinner. There is a particular kind of ambition that does not announce itself loudly. It does not brag at dinner parties or seek the reassurance of applause. It moves quietly, with the focused intensity of something that has decided, at a very deep level, that it has no other choice. It is the ambition of people who have seen something in their minds so clearly, so completely, that the gap between the vision and the reality becomes not a reason for doubt, but simply a problem to be solved, a logistical inconvenience standing between the present moment and the inevitable future. These are the people who build cathedrals and cross oceans and spend 2 decades of their lives on a single idea, not because they are reckless, but because they are, in some fundamental way, incapable of doing anything else. Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi was this kind of man. He was born in 1834 in Colmar, a small city in the Alsace region of northeastern France, a place that sits, geographically and culturally, at the uneasy boundary between French and Roman identity. Alsace had changed hands so many times over the centuries that its people had developed a particular relationship with the question of belonging. They knew in their blood what it meant for national identity to be a contested thing, for the language you spoke at home to be different from the language the government demanded in its offices, for the symbols of your culture to be tolerated, suppressed, celebrated, or erased depending on who happened to be in power that decade. Growing up in Colmar gave Bartholdi something that cannot be taught in art school, an instinctive understanding of what monuments mean to people who need them. He knew, before he ever lifted a chisel, that a great public statue was never just a statue. It was an argument made in permanent materials about who we are and what we believe. His childhood was comfortable, but not lavish. His father died when he was 2 years old, and his mother, Charlotte, became the dominant force in his life. A formidable, intelligent woman who would remain his closest confidant and most reliable correspondent for decades. She shaped him with the particular intensity that devoted single mothers sometimes pour into gifted sons, and the result was a man who was simultaneously deeply confident in his artistic vision and quietly anchored by an emotional seriousness that his more flamboyant contemporaries sometimes mistook for coldness. Bartholdi was not cold, he was concentrated. He showed talent early, and his mother made sure it was developed. He studied painting and then sculpture in Paris, moving through the standard education of a mid-19th century French artist, the copying of classical forms, the mastering of technique, the gradual development of a personal eye. He was good. He was, in fact, better than good, and Paris could see it. His early public sculptures attracted attention and commission. He had the technical skills, the professional connections, and the personal charm to build a perfectly respectable career, producing the kind of statues that filled the public squares of prosperous French cities. Generals on horseback, allegorical figures representing civic virtues, the respectable output of a competent artist living a comfortable life. But Colmar had given him bigger dreams than that. The turning point, the moment that permanently reoriented his artistic ambitions, came in 1855, when Bartholdi traveled to Egypt as part of a small group of French artists. He was 21 years old, and nothing in his Parisian education had prepared him for what he found there. Egypt in the middle of the 19th century was a place where the past was so enormously, so physically present, that standing in front of it could reorganize your sense of what art was capable of. The Sphinx, the temples of Luxor, the colossal figures of Ramesses II at Abu Simbel, each one carved at a scale that made individual human beings feel not merely small, but philosophically reconsidered, as if the act of being that large was itself a statement about the permanence of the ideas the figures represented. Bartholdi stood in front of these things and understood something that changed him permanently. Scale was not a matter of showing off. Scale was meaning. When ancient Egyptian civilization wanted to say that something was eternal, they made it enormous, because the human mind, confronted with something so much larger than itself, cannot help but feel the weight of time. A small statue can be beautiful. A colossal one demands to be reckoned with. It cannot be ignored or passed by or filed away in memory as a pleasant afternoon. It asserts itself. It speaks to people who have not yet been born. He returned to France with his eye permanently calibrated to a larger ambition. His subseq network began to reflect it. He created large public sculptures in Colmar and elsewhere, including an imposing lion carved directly into a sandstone cliff face at Belfort that remains one of the great public monuments of 19th century France. He was building a reputation, developing a style, and proving to himself and to the art world that he had the technical capacity to work at extraordinary scale. But he was also waiting. On some level, he might not have been able to articulate clearly, for the right subject, the right idea, something worthy of the largest ambition he carried inside him. He found it at a dinner party in 1865, Édouard de la Boulaye's proposal, a colossal monument to liberty, a gift from the French people to the Americans, a statement about shared democratic ideals disguised, cleverly, as a diplomatic gesture, hit Bartholdi with the force of recognition. This was not a new idea being presented to him. This was his idea, the one that had been forming in the sediment of his imagination since Egypt, finally arriving from the outside in a form he could act on, a colossal figure, permanent materials, a harbor setting that would give her the sky and water and open distance that Colossus requires to be seen properly, and a meaning, a genuine, politically serious, historically grounded meaning, worthy of the scale he had always wanted to work at. The dinner ended. The idea did not. For the next several years, Bartholdi carried the concept with him the way artists carry things they are not yet ready to make, turning it over, sketching occasionally, letting it develop at the pace that major visions require. France's collapse in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and the subsequent birth of the Third Republic changed the timeline. Le Boulay, sensing that the political moment had shifted enough to allow real action, organized his small circle of Republica into something resembling a committee and made a decision of considerable strategic boldness. He would send Bartholdi to America before the statue existed, to sell a dream on the strength of nothing more than sketches and conviction. The audacity of this requires a moment of full appreciation. In the spring of 1871, Bartholdi boarded a ship for New York carrying letters of introduction to prominent Americans that Le Boulay had carefully arranged, a collection of preliminary sketches for a monument that had no engineering plan, no funding, no confirmed location, and no formal agreement from any American authority whatsoever. He was, in the most technically accurate sense of the phrase, a salesman without a product. He was asking people, senators, presidents, intellectuals, businessmen, to commit their enthusiasm and eventually their money to something that existed only in his head and on paper, and he was asking them to do this for a project that would require the American side to fund and build an enormous stone pedestal, find and approve a suitable site, navigate whatever political and bureaucratic complexities the United States government chose to present, and wait, potentially for many years, while the French side actually constructed the thing. It was, by any rational measure, a proposal that should have been politely declined over and over again until Bartholdi ran out of letters of introduction and sailed home. The fact that it eventually worked has perhaps caused us to underestimate how improbable it seemed in 1871. We look back at the Statue of Liberty now and see inevitability, an iconic image so embedded in the visual vocabulary of the modern world that it is almost impossible to imagine it not existing. But Bartholdi, crossing the Atlantic in 1871, was not traveling toward an inevitable monument. He was traveling toward a series of uncertain conversations with powerful people who had no particular reason to say yes. What he had, in place of a finished product, was something that turned out to be almost as persuasive. An image so vivid in his own mind that he could make other people see it too. He arrived in New York Harbor on a June morning, and the approach to the city by sea gave him the moment he had been waiting for without knowing it. The harbor opened before him, wide, luminous. The harbor opened before him, wide, luminous, the kind of entrance that a great city makes when it wants to announce itself. And Bartholdi looked at a small island in the water called Bedloe's Island and understood immediately, with the spatial certainty of a sculptor who had been thinking about this problem for 6 years, that he had found his location. The figure would stand there. The light would hit her from the east in the mornings. Every ship approaching New York from Europe would pass her. She would be the first thing immigrants saw. She would be the last thing people leaving for Europe carried with them as a memory. He had not been commissioned. He had not been given permission. Bedloe's Island was a military installation controlled by the United States Army. None of this troubled him in any serious way. He noted the location, made his mental measurements, and moved on into the city to begin his campaign. The letters of introduction labelli had provided open doors that would otherwise have been firmly shut to an obscure French sculptor with a speculative project and no official backing. Bartholdi met senators and congressmen. He was received at the White House, where he had a brief and inconclusive meeting with President Ulysses Grant. He traveled through much of the eastern United States and into the Midwest, talking to anyone who might eventually be useful: businessmen, newspaper editors, civic leaders, prominent intellectuals, and anyone else whose instant Husseyism could be recruited into the early coalition of American supporters the project would need. He was charming and persistent, and remarkably good at reading rooms, adjusting his pitch depending on his audience, emphasizing the diplomatic angle with politicians, the artistic ambition with intellectuals, the commercial and civic prestige angle with businessmen, and the emotional meaning of liberty as a shared Franco-American inheritance with anyone who seemed moved by ideas rather than practical considerations, and everywhere he went, he showed the sketches. The sketches themselves were, in the vocabulary of early fundraising, extraordinary tools. Bartholdi was a gifted visual communicator who understood that most people cannot easily translate verbal descriptions of large-scale sculpture into mental images. The sketches did that work for them. They showed a robed female figure, torch raised, standing at enormous scale in a harbor. They were detailed enough to feel real, but not so finished as to seem inflexible. He was offering people a vision, not a fait accompli, and that distinction mattered. He was inviting them into a dream, not presenting them with a bill. The response he got was, at this stage, enthusiasm without commitment. Doors opened. People were interested. Several prominent Americans told him they thought the project was a fine idea and that they would be glad to help when the time came. President Grant, characteristically indirect, offered no formal support but did not close the door. The site at Bedloe's Island seemed like something that could eventually be arranged, though no one was prepared to arrange it yet. There was goodwill. There was in certain quarters genuine excitement. But there was no money, no formal agreement, no signed documents of any kind. Bartholdi returned to France after 5 months, understanding something crucial that La Boule I had perhaps sensed from the beginning. The American enthusiasm was real, but it was conditional. Americans would support this project when it became concrete enough to seem real. The way to make it concrete was to build it, or at least to begin building it, to create physical evidence of French commitment serious enough that the American side would feel the social and diplomatic pressure to follow through on their end. The project needed momentum. It needed visible progress. It needed, in other words, to actually start. He threw himself into the work with the energy of a man who has spent years waiting and is finally at last moving. Back in his Paris studio, Bartholdi began developing the figure in earnest. The image evolved through dozens of iterations. The pose, the arrangement of the robes, the angle of the torch arm, the expression of the face, the relationship between the figure's mass and the sense of movement and life he wanted her to convey. He had decided early on, following the Egyptian precedent, that the face should be serene rather than dramatic. Not the face of someone in the middle of an action, but the face of an idea, permanent and calm. There are persistent and touching stories that he modeled the face on his mother, Charlotte, and while this has never been definitively confirmed, it is consistent with everything we know about their relationship and about the emotional seriousness Bartholdi brought to this project. If she was in some sense building a monument to freedom in France, it is not unreasonable that the face he gave that monument would carry the features of the woman who had shaped his understanding of strength. The figure that emerged from this long process of refinement was unlike anything in the existing vocabulary of 19th century monumental sculpture. She was not a warrior. She was not a goddess in the traditional decorative sense. She was not cold or distant in the way that official statuary so often managed to be. She was something harder to categorize and ultimately more powerful. A woman in motion, or just completing motion, the torch raised with genuine intent, the face composed but not blank, the broken chains at her feet, suggesting not violence but aftermath, the moment after liberation, when the work of being free is just beginning. This was a political vision expressed in sculptural form, and Bartholdi knew it. He also knew, with the practical awareness of a man who had spent 5 months talking to Americans, that the politics needed to be legible without being inflammatory. The monument had to speak to American audiences who were still living in the long, complicated aftermath of the Civil War. A country that had just fought a catastrophic conflict over the meaning of the word liberty and was not necessarily eager to receive a lecture on the subject from France. The broken chains were kept at the base, visible only to those who looked carefully, while the torch in the uplifted stance spoke in a universally accessible visual language of aspiration and hope. He was building something that needed to mean different things to different people without becoming meaningless to any of them. This is, among all the challenges of public art, perhaps the most difficult. Bartholdi spent 20 years solving it, and the solution he arrived at is why she still works. Why people who approach New York Harbor for the first time, as millions have in the century and a half since she was dedicated, still feel something genuine when they see her. The audacity of the whole enterprise, the dinner party idea, the transatlantic pitch, The 2 decades of fundraising and engineering and political negotiation that followed rests, finally, on Bartholdi's refusal to accept the obvious reality that what he was attempting was probably impossible. He was a sculptor from Alsace, with a sketchbook and a dream sailing toward a continent that had not asked for a monument, to sell an idea to people who had no reason to buy it, on behalf of a committee that had no money, in service of a political vision that could not be openly stated. He did it anyway. And it turned out that the audacity was not a flaw in the plan. The audacity was the plan. Because the only way to make something that had never existed before is to behave with absolute conviction, as though it already has. There is a particular kind of awkwardness that settles over a relationship when one party is far more invested than the other. It is the awkwardness of the unreturned letter, the unanswered invitation, the gift offered with trembling hands to someone who receives it with polite confusion and sets it down on a table without quite knowing what to do with it. It is not hostility. Exactly. Hostility would almost be easier to navigate because hostility at least acknowledges that something real is at stake. This was something quieter and, in its own way, more demoralizing, a kind of collective American shrug directed at one of the most ambitious artistic and diplomatic proposals of the 19th century, delivered by a sculptor who had crossed an ocean with nothing but sketches and conviction, on behalf of a nation that had poured years of idealism into a gift that the intended recipient had not actually requested. The United States in the 1870s did not want the Statue of Liberty. This is not quite the right way to say it, because it implies a decisiveness that was never really there. The American response to Bartholdi's proposal and to the broader Franco-American project was not a firm no. It was something much harder to fight against, a protracted, shapeless, deeply frustrating series of enthusiastic noises that never hardened into actual commitment, of promises that evaporated when the time came to honor them, of political goodwill that dissolved the moment anyone mentioned money. The United States did not reject the statue. It simply declined, repeatedly, and in 100 different ways, to take it seriously enough to actually help build it. Understanding why requires understanding what America looked like in the decade after the Civil War. The country that Bartholdi had visited in 1871 was a nation still in the early painful stages of reconstructing itself after the most destructive conflict in its history. Over 600,000 people had died. Entire regions of the South had been reduced to economic ruin. The political landscape was fractured along lines of race, region, and party affiliation in ways that made coherent national policy on almost any subject extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Reconstruction, the federal project of reintegrating the former Confederate states and establishing civil rights for formerly enslaved Black Americans, was grinding forward under constant resistance, both violent and political, and the exhaustion it generated was real and widespread. The country was also, by the mid-1870s, entering the period of profound economic instability that history would call the Long Depression. The Panic of 1873 had triggered a financial crisis that rippled through the economy for years, closing banks, destroying businesses, throwing hundreds of thousands of workers into unemployment, and creating the kind of sustained national anxiety about money that makes any proposal involving discretionary spending feel not merely unnecessary but vaguely offensive. Into this environment, a country tired from war, struggling through economic crisis, consumed by the unglamorous work of political reconstruction, came the proposal for an enormous decorative statue. One can almost hear the response before it was given. The core of the American objection was deceptively simple, and it had a logic that was difficult to argue with on purely practical grounds. The arrangement as Laboulaye and Bartholdi had conceived it divided the financial responsibility between the two nations in what seemed, from the French perspective, like a perfectly equitable way. France would design and build the statue itself, the copper figure, the internal structure, everything above the ground. America would build the pedestal. The two halves would come together on Bedloes Island in New York Harbor, and the completed monument would stand as a joint testament to the friendship and shared values of both nations. This seemed reasonable. What it failed to account for was that many Americans did not see why they should pay for any part of a gift they had not asked for. The question was asked in newspapers, in congressional debates, in the letters columns of periodicals from New York to San Francisco, and it was asked with a directness that brooked no diplomatic softening. If this is a French gift to America, why is America being asked to contribute to it? The logic was not unreasonable. When someone gives you a present, you do not expect to be handed a bill for the box it came in. The pedestal framing, the idea that France was giving the statue while America merely provided its foundation, struck many Americans as a distinction without a meaningful difference. A foundation was not a minor accessory. It was a massive stone structure that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to build. Calling it the American contribution to a French gift felt, to a significant portion of the American public, like an elaborate way of asking the United States to pay for something it had never requested. Congress, that reliable barometer of where American public sentiment meets institutional reluctance, made its position clear early and maintained it with impressive consistency. Multiple proposals were brought before the legislature to allocate federal funds for the pedestal construction. Multiple times, Congress declined. The debates were not particularly passionate. There was no great crusade against the statue, no organized opposition that rose up in furious objection. There was simply the quiet, implacable resistance of a legislative body that had other priorities, constituents who were not demanding this particular expenditure, and no compelling political reason to say yes. The Joint Committee established to manage the American side of the project, which eventually evolved into the American Committee for the Statue of Liberty, found itself in the peculiar position of advocating for a monument that its own government refused to fund. It was composed largely of prominent New York figures, businessmen, lawyers, civic leaders, businessmen, lawyers, civic leaders, the kind of well-connected men who could open doors and generate press coverage but who could not, ultimately, substitute their personal enthusiasm for the institutional commitment the project required. They raised money, they organized events, they published pamphlets, they maintained a public presence that kept the project nominally alive in American awareness, but the gap between what they managed to raise and what the pedestal actually required was enormous, and it stayed enormous for years. The site itself became, for a considerable period, a source of absurdity that might have been comic under different circumstances. Bedloe's Island, where Bartholdi had decided the statue would stand during that first illuminated morning approach to New York Harbor in 1871, was indeed approved as the location, one of the few concrete steps the American side managed to take with reasonable efficiency. But approving a location and preparing it are different things entirely. Years passed, the island sat, the foundation work did not begin. The American Committee issued optimistic statements about imminent progress that were not followed by actual progress. Bartholdi, watching from France where the statue's construction was advancing in his studio and workshops, wrote letters that grew increasingly pointed in their frustration, carefully wrapped in the diplomatic language that the correspondence between a French artist and his American collaborators required. He had by this point been working on the project for years. The construction of the statue itself was an undertaking of almost incomprehensible complexity and ambition, and it was moving forward on the French side with the momentum that La Boulaye and Bartholdi had always intended as a way of creating social pressure on the Americans. The torch arm had been completed and displayed at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876, a deliberate publicity gesture designed to show American audiences what was coming and generate enthusiasm that might translate into donations. The head and crown had been exhibited in Paris. Bartholdi was traveling between France and America with the energy of a man who has committed so fully to something that the concept of giving up has simply ceased to exist as a mental option. And still the pedestal funds did not materialize. There was also a geographic dimension to the American indifference that complicated the fundraising effort in ways that proved surprisingly stubborn. The Statue of Liberty was, geographically, a New York monument. It would stand in New York Harbor, on an island controlled by the federal government, but surrounded by New York waters, visible primarily to New York waters, visible primarily to New York. The rest of the country felt this, correctly, as a somewhat parochial concern. Why should taxpayers in Ohio or Georgia or Illinois contribute federal money to a decorative structure in New York Harbor that they would almost certainly never see in person? New York was already the wealthiest and most powerful city in America. New York could pay for its own monument. This argument resonated in Congress, where representatives from states with no direct stake in New York's civic beautification saw no particular reason to redirect their constituents' tax dollars toward a harbor ornament for the financial capital of the country. The proposal that federal money should fund the pedestal died repeatedly on this objection, and it was not an entirely unreasonable one. The Statue of Liberty was being positioned as a national monument, but its benefits, whatever those benefits were understood to be, accrued overwhelmingly to a single city. New York's own wealthy class, meanwhile, proved remarkably reluctant to fill the gap that federal funding refused to provide. This is perhaps the most consistently surprising element of the whole story, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives. New York, in the 1870s and 1880s, was home to some of the greatest concentrations of private wealth in the history of the United States. The Gilded Age was producing fortunes of extraordinary size, and the men who held those fortunes were not, as a class, opposed to public display. They built mansions and endowed museums, and funded opera houses, and contributed to the construction of the institutions that gave New York its cultural authority. They understood perfectly well the relationship between civic generosity and social prestige. A donation toward a monument to liberty in New York Harbor was exactly the kind of visible, permanent reputation-enhancing expenditure that one might expect to appeal to men of wealth who wished to associate their names with something lasting. And yet they did not give, not in the amounts the project required, not with the consistency that a sustained fundraising campaign needed. The American Committee organized dinners and benefit events and approached the city's financial elite with the project, and received over and over again the response that had characterized the entire American relationship with this monument from the beginning: polite interest, warm words, and inadequate action. The reasons for this reluctance are not entirely clear even now, and they were probably not entirely clear to the people involved at the time. Part of it was surely the sense that this was someone else's project, a French thing, an immigrant thing, a harbor thing, a New York thing, depending on where you stood, never quite your thing. Never quite the project that landed in the specific intersection of your values and your priorities with enough force to open your checkbook meaningfully. Part of it was the economic climate, which remained difficult for long enough to provide a convenient excuse for anyone who wished to use it. Part of it was simply the chronic difficulty of fundraising for large public projects, which has defeated many well-intentioned campaigns in every era. But there was also something else, something that surfaces occasionally in the commentary of the period, and that speaks to a deeper ambivalence about what the statue actually meant. Not everyone in America in the 1870s and 1880s was comfortable with the symbolism Bartholdi and Laboulaye had embedded in the project, a monument to liberty, built with explicit reference to the ideals of democratic republicanism, carrying at its base the broken chains of abolished slavery. Positioned at the entrance to America's greatest immigrant harbor, this was not a neutral statement. It made imply sick claims about what America was and what it stood for. And in a country that was simultaneously celebrating its democratic ideals and violently suppressing the civil rights of Black Americans under the emerging architecture of Jim Crow segregation, that implicit claim sat uneasily with a portion of the population that preferred its national symbols to be inspirational in an abstract way rather than pointed in a specific one. The statue asked Americans to believe something about themselves, and some Americans, looking at the reality of their country in those decades, were not entirely sure they wanted to be asked that question quite so visibly, quite so permanently, right there in the entrance to their most important harbor. This discomfort was rarely stated explicitly. It did not need to be. It manifested simply as one more current in the general tide of American lukewarmness that kept the pedestal unfunded and the foundation undug while Bartholdi wrote increasingly frustrated letters from Paris, and the American Committee issued increasingly strained optimistic statements that convinced fewer and fewer people who were paying attention. By the early 1880s, the project was in genuine crisis. The statue itself was well advanced in construction. Bartholdi's workshops had been producing the copper panels for years. Gustave Eiffel's internal iron armature, the revolutionary engineering solution that would allow the statue to flex in the wind rather than crack under pressure, was being assembled. The French side was doing what it had promised to do. The deadline pressure was real and building. On the American side, the pedestal foundation had finally begun, had run out of money, and had stopped. The construction site on Bedloe's Island sat half completed, an architectural embarrassment that visited reporters dutifully described with the barely concealed delight that Jor. Novellists tend to bring to stories about grand ambitions meeting inglorious reality. There were serious discussions within the American committee about whether the statue might need to find a different home. Boston was mentioned. Philadelphia was mentioned. There were suggestions from other cities that they would be delighted to receive the monument if New York proved incapable of meeting its obligations. These discussions were painful, but they were also real. The people having them were not being melodramatic. The money had run out. The foundation was unfinished. The French were growing impatient, and the most powerful government in the Western Hemisphere was declining to spend $1 on it. The gift that France had conceived as a testament to the friendship between two great democracies had, somewhere in the gap between the inspiration and the execution, become an embarrassment, not a loud, dramatic embarrassment. America was not fighting with France, was not refusing the statue in terms of high political theater. It was a quiet, procedural, institutional embarrassment, the kind that happens not through decisive action, but through the accumulation of small failures, the meeting that produces no decision, the promise that generates no follow-through, the enthusiastic statement that is never backed by the commitment it implies. The statue was crossing the Atlantic in crates. The pedestal was not ready to receive her, and the question hanging over Bedloe's Island, over the American committee's increasingly desperate meetings, over the entire 20-year project of two nations attempting to build something together that neither could build alone, was brutally simple. After all of this, after the dinner party and the sketches and the transatlantic voyages and the decades of construction and the copper and the iron and the 20-odd years of Bartholdi's life poured into this single enormous, unreasonable dream, was America actually going to let it fail? The answer, when it finally came, arrived from a direction that almost no one had predicted, not from Congress, not from the wealthy elite of New York, not from the federal government or the state government or any of the official institutions that had spent a decade demonstrating their capacity for enthusiastic inaction. It came from the people, from the ordinary working, arguing, immigrant, dreaming, perpetually surprising American public. The people the statue had always been meant for, long before they knew it was coming. But that is the next part of the story. Before we talk about the engineering, we need to talk about the problem. Because it is easy, standing at a distance of nearly 140 years, to look at the Statue of Liberty and see something inevitable. A finished thing inevitable, a finished thing, a solved thing, a monument so thoroughly completed and so permanently present that the difficulties of its construction have been smoothed away by time into a kind of comfortable legend. She stands, she has always stood, she will, presumably, continue to stand. The engineering question feels, from this distance, like a detail, a footnote, the kind of technical matter that gets a paragraph in the history books before the narrative moves on to more photogenic subjects. But in the early 1870s, when Frederick August Bartholdi was staring at the problem of how to actually build what he had been promising people for years, the engineering question was not a footnote. It was an abyss. It was the thing that stood between his vision and reality, with the implacable authority of physical law, and it had no obvious solution, and the people he initially trusted to solve it were not, as it turned out, quite equal to the task. Here is the problem, stated plainly. Bartholdi wanted to build a hollow copper statue over 150 feet tall, taller than almost any structure most people in the 19th century had ever seen, up close, and he wanted it to stand on an island in a harbor, exposed on all sides to the wind coming off the open Atlantic. The copper itself would be thin, because solid copper at that scale would be impossibly heavy and ruinously expensive. Thin copper meant the structural integrity of the statue could not come from the outer skin. It had to come from something inside, an internal framework, a skeleton, that would bear the loads the wind imposed, transfer them safely to the foundation, and do all of this without cracking, without buckling, and without tearing the copper skin away from whatever it was attached to. This was, by the engineering standards of the 1870s, a genuinely novel problem. The great monumental sculptures of the ancient world had been solid stone. Their mass was their strength. Their weight was their stability. Medieval and Renaissance bronze casting worked at scales where the material itself could bear the structural loads. Nobody had ever attempted to build a hollow metal figure of anything approaching this size, and then ask it to stand outdoors in one of the more meteorologically aggressive harbors on the eastern seaboard of North America, taking full-force Atlantic winds on a body whose largest surface area, the robes, the outstretched arm, the broad planes of the figure, was essentially a sail. Bartholdi understood the artistic side of this problem instinctively. He had spent years developing the figure, refining the form, solving the aesthetic and symbolic questions with the confidence of a man working in his area of mastery. The engineering side was different. He knew it was different. He was honest enough with himself, which was one of his better qualities, to understand that the structural challenges of what he was proposing exceeded his expertise, and he sought help accordingly. His first choice was Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, which was not an unreasonable selection on the face of it. Viollet-le-Duc was one of the most celebrated architects and structural theorists in France, a man famous for his restoration of medieval cathedrals, his theoretical writings on Gothic structural systems, and his ability to think about buildings and large structures with a combination of historical knowledge and practical ingenuity that had earned him enormous professional respect. He was old by the time Bartholdi came to him, and his health was declining, but his mind was still sharp and his reputation was unassailable. Viollet-le-Duc developed a structural concept for the statue that was, in retrospect, a solution shaped more by the materials and methods he knew best than by the specific demands of this particular problem. His approach involved filling the interior of the statue with a series of compartments packed with sand. The sand would provide ballast, stability, weight low in the structure to resist the overturning force of the wind. It was a solution that drew on principles from masonry construction, from the heavy, gravity-dependent structural logic of the stone buildings he had spent his career working with. For a metal structure of this kind, it was not quite right. Though Viollet-le-Duc died in 1879 before the question could be fully tested, leaving Bartholdi with an incomplete structural scheme and a mounting sense of urgency. The statue needed a new engineer. The man who came next was not an obvious choice in the way that Viollet-le-Duc had been. He was not primarily known as a designer of monuments or public sculpture. He was a bridge builder. He was known for the elegant, technically sophisticated iron railway bridges he had been constructing across France for years, structures that were admired by engineers for their efficiency and economy, for the way they solved structural problems with a minimum of material and a maximum of ingenuity. He was in his mid-40s at the height of his professional powers, running a company that had established itself as one of the leading structural engineering firms in France. He was not famous yet, not in the way that would come later, the tower that would make his name a permanent fixture. And the global imagination was still a decade away. His name was Alexandre Gustave Eiffel. Let that land for a moment, because it deserves to. The man who built the internal skeleton of the Statue of Liberty, the engineer who solved the structural problem that had defeated his predecessor and made the whole monument possible, is the same man who would later build the most recognizable tower in the world. Gustave Eiffel. The Eiffel spent several years of his professional life working on the structural system of Lady Liberty before he ever drew a line of what would become the Eiffel Tower. The tower came later. The statue came first, and the engineering lessons Eiffel learned solving the structural puzzle of a colossal copper figure swaying in harbor winds were not unrelated to the structural thinking he would bring to a wrought iron tower rising 900 feet above the Champ de Mars. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. When Eiffel came to the statue problem, he did what good engineers always do first. He looked at the actual forces involved with fresh eyes and refused to be bound by the solutions his predecessor had proposed. The question he asked was not, how do we stabilize a heavy structure with ballast and mass? That was Viollet-le-Duc's question, inherited from masonry thinking. Eiffel's question was different. It was, what are the actual loads this structure will experience, and what is the most efficient way to carry those loads safely to the ground? The answer he arrived at was revolutionary. And it was revolutionary precisely because it ran counter to every intuition that a non-engineer might bring to the problem of making a very large structure stand up. The intuition is to make it heavy and solid. More mass equals more stability. This is the logic of the pyramid and the castle wall and the stone cathedral. It is a logic that works beautifully for street structures built of masonry, where the material is dense and strong in compression, and the dominant structural challenge is making sure nothing slides or topples. Eiffel's insight was that for a metal structure of this kind, in this location, the dominant structural challenge was not gravity. It was wind. And wind does not care about mass in the simple way that gravity does. Wind imposes dynamic loads that change direction and magnitude constantly, that create not just lateral forces but complex patterns of pressure and suction across irregular surfaces. A heavy, rigid structure fights those forces by brute weight and stiffness, and when the forces are large enough, a rigid structure cracks. It has no give. It transmits the loads fully and the material fails. What Eiffel proposed instead was a structure that could move, not collapse, not wobble visibly, but flex, deflex under load in controlled, calculated ways, distribute the stress across the entire system rather than concentrating it at any single point, and then return to its original position when the load was removed. He designed a central iron pylon, a massive vertical spine rising through the interior of the statue, from which the outer copper skin would be hung on a system of secondary iron framing that connected the skin to the pylon through a network of flat iron bars. These bars were not rigidly attached to the copper skin. They were connected through a system of small brackets that allowed the copper panels to move slightly, relative to the iron frame, to expand and contract with temperature changes, to flex under wind pressure, to behave, in a sense, like the scales of a fish or the feathers of a wing, rather than like the stones of a wall. This distinction between a structure that resists by rigidity and one that resists by controlled flexibility was not merely a technical refinement, it was a conceptual leap that represented some of the most advanced structural thinking of the 19th century, and it came directly from Eiffel's deep experience with iron bridges. Bridges, unlike buildings, must deal with dynamic loads as a matter of routine. A railway bridge does not experience the same force twice in the same way. The load changes as the train moves across it. The wind varies, the temperature fluctuates. The material expands and contracts through daily and seasonal cycles. Bridge engineers in the 19th century had been developing, largely through experience and a growing body of theoretical understanding, the tools to think about structures that lived in a world of changing forces rather than static ones. Eiffel had built dozens of bridges. He had learned through that work that flexibility was not a weakness in a structure. Properly designed and controlled, it was a form of strength. He brought that understanding to the statue, and it transformed the project. The central pylon he designed was not elegant in the way that the finished statue was elegant. It was a utilitarian thing, a massive iron post braced with diagonal members, built to do a job rather than to be admired. It would be completely invisible in the finished monument, hidden inside the copper form that Bartholdi had spent years perfecting. Nobody visiting the statue would ever see it. Nobody standing in the torch gallery looking out over New York Harbor would be thinking about the iron engineering holding them in the air. That invisibility was the point. The best structural engineering is the kind that disappears entirely into the experience of whatever it makes possible. The secondary framing that connected the pylon to the copper skin was an engineering achievement of considerable delicacy. A system of flat iron bars radiating outward from the central structure and attaching to the armature that shaped each copper panel. The connections were designed to allow the copper to move without tearing, to flex without fatigue, to accommodate the inevitable differential thermal expansion between copper and iron without building up the cumulative stress that would eventually crack a rigidly connected system. This last point deserves emphasis because it is the reason the statue still stands today. Copper and iron expand and contract at different rates when temperature changes. If you bolt them rigidly together and then subject them to the full range of New York Harbor temperatures, from the brutal cold of January to the sweltering heat of August, cycling through that range twice every day, as day turns to night and night turns to day, repeated thousands of times over decades, the stress accumulates. Materials fatigue. Connections fail. Eventually something breaks. Eiffel solved this by designing the connection system to accommodate the movement rather than prevent it. The copper can move relative to the iron. The stress does not accumulate. The system does not fatigue in the same catastrophic way. This is why after nearly 140 years of New York Harbor weather, the storms and the temperature cycles and the salt air and the wind, she is still standing. Not because the materials are indestructible, but because the engineering was wise enough to work with physical reality rather than against it. There is a particular satisfaction in understanding this. Once you understand it, when you look at photographs of the statue's interior framework, the images that show the central pylon and the radiating armature, the iron skeleton that nobody ever sees, it looks almost biological. It looks like the inside of a living thing, like the bone and cartilage structure of some large creature designed by evolution to handle forces from multiple directions simultaneously. This is not entirely a coincidence. Eiffel was, in his engineering instincts, moving in the direction that biological structures had already arrived at, toward forms that are efficient, flexible, adaptive, toward forms that are efficient, flexible, adaptive, that carry loads through networks of distributed elements, rather than concentrating stress at single points of rigid connection. Nature builds this way because rigid structures break and flexible ones survive. Eiffel built this way because experience had taught him what nature had worked out over millions of years. The statue that emerged from this collaboration between artist and engineer is, in its invisible interior, one of the most sophisticated structural achievements of the 19th century. It is more sophisticated, in some ways, than many structures that came after it, because it was designed to solve a problem that most structural engineers of the period had not yet clearly formulated for themselves. What is also remarkable, and what tends to get lost when we focus on the technical achievement, is the personal dynamic between Bartholdi and Eiffel and what it required of both of them. Bartholdi was not an engineer. He was a sculptor, an artist, a visionary, with a specific and fully realized aesthetic intention for his monument. Eiffel was not a sculptor. He was an engineer, a builder, a man whose native language was the language of forces and materials and structural behavior under load. Collaborations between artists and engineers are notoriously difficult because the priorities that drive each discipline are genuinely different and sometimes genuinely in conflict. The artist wants the form to be what it needs to be. The engineer wants the structure to work. These goals usually align, but when they do not, the negotiation can be painful. The evidence suggests that Bartholdi and Eiffel managed this collaboration with unusual grace. Eiffel's structural system was designed from the beginning to serve Bartholdi's artistic vision. The pylon is positioned, scaled, and proportioned specifically to support the copper form that Bartholdi had already developed, rather than requiring the form to adapt to a predetermined structural grid. Eiffel worked inside Bartholdi's vision, rather than imposing a competing one. He solved the engineering problem on the problem's own terms, which is the highest form of structural engineering, and also, when it happens in a collaboration, the surest sign of professional respect. For his part, Bartholdi gave Eiffel the creative latitude to solve the structural problem in whatever way his engineering judgment required, trusting that the invisible interior of his monument was in good hands and concentrating his own energy on the exterior form that the world would see. The division of labor was clean and honest. Each man was doing what he was best at, in service of something neither could have built alone. The resulting structure stood in Bartholdi's Paris workshops, as it was assembled in sections, and it must have been a genuinely extraordinary thing to see. The iron skeleton rising in the open air, the copper skin being fitted section by section around it, the figure taking on her final form piece by assembled piece. By assembled piece, the torch arm reaching upward in what must have seemed, in a Paris workshop in the 1880s, like the most improbable and magnificent sight imaginable. She was disassembled and packed into 214 crates for the voyage across the Atlantic. The iron and the copper, the pylon and the armature, and the 10 years of Eiffel's engineering thought embedded invisibly in the system of brackets and flat bars and flexible connections. All of it folded back into a collection of numbered pieces, loaded onto a French naval vessel, and sent across the ocean tover. Third, a pedestal that was not yet ready to receive it. The engineering that Eiffel had provided would spend the crossing in the dark of the ship's hold, surrounded by other crates waiting for the reassembly that would return it to its intended form. But the engineering was there. It had been solved. The problem that had stood between Bartholdi's vision and reality, the abyss of structural uncertainty that had yawned open after Viollet Leduc's death and threatened to swallow the whole project, had been filled by a bridge builder from Bordeaux who had not yet built his tower and would not build it for several more years. Years later, when people all over the world began associating Eiffel's name exclusively with the Iron Tower on the Champ de Mars, the connection between that name and the skeleton inside the most famous statue in the world grew quieter, less discussed, more thoroughly buried under the weight of the tower's overwhelming fame. But the connection is there. Invisible, like the armature itself, doing its work in the dark, and it is why she still stands. There is a specific kind of dread that belongs to people who have committed everything to something that is running out of time. It is not the clean, clarifying dread of a sudden crisis, the kind that sharpens the mind and produces decisive action and makes for good stories afterward. It is the slower, more corrosive dread of watching something you love approach a cliff in increments, close enough to see the edge clearly, far enough away that each day still feels like a day in which disaster might yet be avoided, close enough that the avoidance feels less and less plausible as the weeks accumulate into months and the months accumulate into years. It is the dread of a project that is dying not from a single killing blow, but from the steady, unremarkable hemorrhage of insufficient funding, institutional indifference, and the particular cruelty of time passing while the gap between what exists and what is needed stays stubbornly, humiliatingly wide. Frederick Auguste Bartholdi knew this dread intimately by the early 1880s. He had been living with the Statue of Liberty for nearly 2 decades. He had crossed the Atlantic multiple times. He had spent years in his Paris workshops overseeing the construction of something that had no precedent in the history of monumental sculpture. He had navigated the death of his original structural engineer and the recruitment of Gustave Eiffel as a replacement. He had managed the construction of the copper skin panel by panel, the assembly of Eiffel's iron armature piece by piece, the gradual and painstaking emergence of the figure from the accumulated labor of dozens of craftsmen working in a workshop in Paris that had become, in its own modest way, one of the most remarkable manufacturing sites in Europe. He had done all of this on the French side of the Atlantic, sustained by the fundraising efforts of the Franco-American Union, while watching the American side of the project stall, restart, stall again, and gradually settle into a condition of chronic financial insufficiency that was beginning to look less like a temporary problem and more like a permanent state. The crisis, when it arrived in its fullest form, arrived on both sides of the ocean simultaneously, which made it considerably worse. Begin with France, because France had been, by any fair accounting, the more disciplined partner in this project from the beginning. La Boule and the Franco-American Union had understood from the outset that raising the money to design, engineer, and construct a colossal copper statue from scratch was not going to happen through the generosity of a small number of wealthy donors writing large checks. The French establishment, the aristocracy, and the financial elite were not natural enthusiasts for a project that was explicitly tied to Republican political ideology. The monument was conceived as an expression of democratic values, as a statement about the kind of France that La Boule and his circle believed in and hoped for. And that ideology did not reliably inspire the people who had done well under the arrangements the current France provided. So the Franco-American Union turned to the French public, and what followed was one of the most creative and sustained popular fundraising campaigns of the 19th century. The lottery was the most straightforward tool. The Union organized a national lottery with prizes attractive enough to generate broad participation, and the French public bought tickets with an enthusiasm that suggested the project had tapped into something genuine in the national mood. France had lost the Franco-Prussian War less than a decade earlier. The country had been occupied, humiliated, forced to cede Alsace-Lorraine, Bartholdi's home region, to the newly unified German Empire. National pride was a complicated, tender thing in France in the 1870s, and the Statue of Liberty, whatever its diplomatic framing, offered French citizens a way to participate in something that felt like a restoration of national dignity, a French gift to America, French engineering, French craftsmanship, French ideals, exported to the world in copper and iron. Buying a lottery ticket was, in some small way, buying a share of that pride. The subscriptions followed a similar logic. The Franco-American Union organized a public subscription campaign that invited citizens to contribute directly to the construction costs, and the response demonstrated the genuinely democratic character of the project. Donations came in from across the social spectrum, from cities and towns, from civic organizations and professional associations, from school children contributing centimes saved from their allowances, from workers contributing small fractions of modest wages. The breadth of participation was itself a political statement. This was not a monument built by French wealth for French prestige. It was a monument built by French citizens, the whole range of them, for an idea. The cities contributed through their municipal governments. Paris gave, Lyon gave, Bordeaux gave. Smaller cities and towns gave proportionally, with the civic pride of communities that wished to be counted among the builders of something historic. The government of the French Republic, cautiously supportive of a project that served its interesting France's democratic credentials to the world without requiring any dramatic domestic political gesture, contributed some support as well, enough to signal official blessing without being generous enough to define the project as a government initiative rather than a popular one. The exhibition strategy was perhaps the most ingenious element of the French fundraising effort, and it was Bartholdi's own contribution to the problem of making an imaginary monument feel real enough to inspire financial commitment. The construction of the statue proceeded in sections over years, and Bartholdi made a deliberate decision to exhibit completed sections publicly before the whole was assembled. This was not merely a practical matter of showcasing progress. It was a carefully considered strategy for converting abstract enthusiasm into concrete donations. When people could stand next to the completed torch arm, when they could see the actual scale of what was being built, when the abstraction of a colossal statue became the physical reality of a copper hand and a torch that towered above them, the project stopped being an idea and became an experience. Experiences motivated people in ways that ideas alone rarely do. The torch arm was shipped to Philadelphia in 1876 for the Centennial Exposition, and the crowds who filed past it, who paid a small admission fee to climb up inside it and stand on the torch balcony, looking out over the exposition grounds, went away with something they had not had before, a sensory memory of the scale of this thing. The fee they paid was a fundraising contribution. The memory they took with them was more valuable than any pamphlet the American Committee could have distributed. Scale, as Bartholdi had understood since Egypt, was meaning. When you made people feel small, you made them feel something. The head and crown were exhibited in Paris, and the same dynamic repeated itself. Visitors paid admission. The admission fees contributed to construction costs. The experience of standing next to the crown's 7 rays, each one taller than a human being, converted abstract sympathy into active investment. The exhibition strategy raised money, and it did something arguably more important. It built a constituency of people who felt personally connected to the monument's completion, who had paid their admission and climbed the torch and touched the copper, and were now, in some small but real way, stakeholders in whether this thing actually got finished. All of this was necessary because the costs kept coming. The engineering changes that came with Eiffel's involvement, the redesign of the entire structural system after Viollet-le-Duc's death, the new armature, the new connections between copper and iron were more expensive than the original plans had anticipated. Good engineering at this scale is never cheap, and revolutionary engineering is more expensive than conventional engineering, because the problems it solves have not been solved before, and the solutions cannot be copied from precedent. Every calculation was new. Every connection detail was developed from scratch. The cost accumulated, and the Franco-American Union went back to the French public again and again asking for more. The French public, remarkably, kept giving, not infinitely, not without fatigue, but with a persistence that reflected genuine popular investment in the project that the fundraising campaigns had successfully cultivated over the years. By the time the statue was complete and ready for shipping, France had raised approximately 2.1 million francs, an extraordinary sum generated almost entirely through small contributions from ordinary citizens who had never expected to build a monument but found themselves doing it anyway. And across the ocean, in New York, the pedestal had no foundation. The American side of the project was a study in institutional failure that grew more painful with each passing year. The American Committee, which had been organized to manage the fundraising and construction of the pedestal, was composed of men with excellent connections and genuine enthusiasm, who had proven, over a decade of effort, that excellent connections and genuine enthusiasm were not sufficient substitutes for the sustained organized popular fundraising campaign that the project actually required. The pedestal was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the most prestigious American architect of the period, and it was designed with the grandeur appropriate to its purpose, a massive granite structure, rising 89 feet above the island's foundation. It was intended to be the base upon which the statue would stand, and from which she would be visible across the harbor. Hunt's design was serious, monumental, worthy of what it would support. It was also expensive. The total cost of the pedestal and its foundation was estimated at somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000, a figure that the American Committee had been failing to raise for years. Congress had refused federal funding. The reasons were various and consistent: fiscal conservatism, the geographic argument that this was a New York monument rather than a national one, the political difficulty of asking taxpayers across the country to fund a decorative structure for New York Harbor, the lingering sense that if this was a French gift, then the French could pay for all of it. The refusals were delivered politely and repeatedly, and with the immovable quality that congressional indifference, once established, characteristically maintains. New York State was approached and declined at the state level. New York City's government made gestures of support that did not translate into meaningful financial contribution. The city's wealthy class gave sporadically, insufficiently, with the half-heartedness of people donating to a cause they approved of in principle, but did not feel urgently called to fund in practice. By 1883, with the statue nearing completion in Paris, and the shipping date approaching with the inexorable logic of an engineering schedule that was no longer under anyone's control, the pedestal construction had begun and stopped. The granite blocks rose to a certain height, and then the money ran out and the work stopped, and the unfinished foundation sat on Bedloe's Island in the harbor, half a pedestal, an architectural monument to American indecision. Newspaper reporters who visited the site described it with the kind of restrained precision that makes an image devastating. The cut stone, the stopped cranes, the silence where construction noise should have been, the visual bluntness of a project that had run out of money in the middle of its most visible phase. The threat to move the statue somewhere else was not merely rhetorical. It had organizational weight behind it. Boston C. Tizens had organized a committee to receive the statue if New York defaulted. Philadelphia had expressed interest. The conversations were real, and the American Committee in New York knew they were real, and the knowledge produced something that chronic organizational failure rarely produces: genuine alarm. Because the statue was coming, the crates were being packed in Paris. Bartholdi had spent 20 years on this project, and he was not going to unpack the crates, because New York had mismanaged its fundraising. The shipping date was not a negotiating position. It was a fact. The statue would arrive in New York Harbor in 1885, and it would need somewhere to stand. And if that somewhere was not a completed pedestal on Bedloe's Island, then it would be somewhere else, and New York would carry the distinction of being the city that had been offered the most iconic monument of the modern world, and had failed to build a base for it. The situation required something the American Committee had not yet managed to produce: urgency. Real, communicable, emotionally compelling urgency, not the polite urgency of fundraising pamphlets addressed to wealthy donors who could be expected to weigh the request against their other philanthropic commitments and respond at their leisure. The visceral urgency of a deadline that was actually a deadline, attached to a consequence that was actually a consequence, delivered through a channel that reached not the wealthy few but the broad, opinionated, engaged American public. It required a newspaper. It required a specific newspaper, and a specific editor, and a specific kind of campaign that had not been tried yet. The American Committee did not know this yet. They were still trying the approaches that had not worked, sending letters to wealthy men who had already demonstrated their capacity to receive those letters with sympathetic inaction. The statue was in crates. The pedestal was on crates. The money was gone. The cities of Boston and Philadelphia were waiting with their alternative proposals. And the clock was running. The whole 20-year project, the dinner party in 1865, Bartholdi's transatlantic voyage with nothing but sketches, the lottery tickets, and the exhibition admissions, and the small donations from French school children, the engineering genius of Gustave Eiffel working invisibly inside the copper form, the 214 crates currently being assembled in a Paris workshop, all of it had arrived at a moment of genuine, unambiguous crisis. It was possible, in a way that it had not been possible at any earlier point in the project's long history, to see clearly how this ended badly. To see the statue sitting in crates on a dock, waiting for an American decision that did not come, to see the French patience finally exhaust itself, to see the copper and iron, all those years of labor and idealism, and transnational friendship and democratic symbolism, melted down or sold or dispersed in ways that history would record as a cautionary tale about the distance between grand intentions and completed monuments. It was possible to see liberty not standing. The people who needed to prevent this were not, as it turned out, going to be found in the offices of the American Committee, or the chambers of Congress, or the drawing rooms of New York's financial elite. They were everywhere else. They were in the tenements and the workshops and the small apartments and the modest houses of ordinary Americans who had never been asked, in the right way at the right moment, by the right voice, whether they wanted to be the people who built the base of something lasting. They had never been asked because the people doing the asking had not yet understood who they needed to ask. That understanding, when it say, aim would come from a newspaper editor who had built his career on understanding exactly this, on knowing that the power to move a democracy did not live in its wealthiest citizens, but in its most numerous ones, and that the right story, told in the right way, to the right audience, could accomplish what years of polite appeals to privilege had failed to do. But the crisis had to become completely undeniable first, and in the winter of 1883 and into 1884, with the pedestal stopped and the money gone and the statue in crates and the deadline approaching, it had become exactly that. Joseph Pulitzer understood something about ordinary people that most powerful men in 19th century America did not. He understood it not as an abstraction, not as a political theory or a journalistic philosophy that he had arrived at through study and reflection, but as something lived, something ground into him by the specific texture of his own experience in a way that could not be unlearned or argued away or forgotten in the comfortable distance that wealth and success create between a person and the life they came from. Pulitzer had been ordinary. He had been, in fact, considerably worse than ordinary. He had arrived in the United States as a 17-year-old Hungarian immigrant in 1864, recruited to fight in the final year of the Civil War as part of a scheme by which unscrupulous agents collected bounties for delivering foreign recruits to understaffed Union regiments. He had arrived friendless, nearly penniless, speaking almost no English, in a country that was consuming its young men at a rate that should have terrified anyone paying attention. He paid attention. He survived the war, survived the chaotic years that followed it, taught himself English with ferocious discipline, read everything he could find, talked to everyone who would talk to him, and began the long improv, able climb that would eventually make him one of the most powerful figures in American journalism. He bought the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and made it profitable through a combination of aggressive reporting, genuine concern for working-class readers, and an editorial instinct so sharp it seemed almost unfair. Then he bought the New York World in 1883, a failing paper that its previous owners had been unable to make work, and set about transforming it with the same energy and clarity of purpose he had brought to everything else. The World under Pulitzer was not a genteel publication. It was not written for the educated elite, who already had newspapers that catered to their sensibilities and confirmed their assumptions. It was written for the people Pulitzer had been, the immigrants, the workers, the tenement dwellers, the ordinary Americans who were building the country with their labor and being largely ignored by the institutions that claimed to speak for it. He covered stories that the respectable press considered beneath its dignity. He ran illustrations when other papers ran only columns of unbroken text. He wrote in language that people who worked with their hands could read on a crowded streetcar after a 10-hour shift. He understood, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had lived it, that the people at the bottom of the economic pyramid were not less intelligent, or less engaged, or less capable of passion and opinion than the people at the top. They were simply less served, less seen, less addressed as though their attention and their money and their participation in civic life actually mattered. He was about to discover just how much it mattered. The Statue of Liberty crisis landed on Pulitzer's desk in early 1883 in the form of a fact that a less attentive editor might have filed away as a minor embarrassment, rather than recognizing as a story with the potential to change everything. The American Committee's pedestal fund had run out. Construction had stopped. The statue was in crates in France. The deadline was real. And the wealthy men who might have solved this problem with the kind of donations that wealthy men in the Gilded Age sometimes made to large civic projects had, collectively, declined to do so. Pulitzer looked at this situation and saw something that the American Committee, still directing its appeals upward toward the powerful and the prosperous, had failed to see. He saw that they were asking the wrong people. The Statue of Liberty was not, in its bones, a monument for the wealthy. It had never been. La Boulai's original vision had been explicitly democratic. A gift from the people of France to the people of America, a statement about what free citizens could build together. A monument to the ideals that gave ordinary people dignity, and standing in a world that had historically organized itself around the comfort and authority of the few. The statue had been funded on the French side by lottery tickets and small subscriptions and admission fees paid by workers and shopkeepers and school children. The whole French fundraising campaign had been, from beginning to end, a demonstration of what popular democratic commitment looked like when it was properly organized and genuinely invited. America had not tried this. America had spent a decade asking rich men for large donations and receiving polite regrets. The people who had never been asked were everywhere, in the 5-story tenements of the Lower East Side, in the workshops and factories of Brooklyn. But Brooklyn meant it, that in the small apartments where immigrant families were building new American lives, with the specific, personal urgency of people who had crossed oceans to be here and understood in their bodies what liberty meant in a way that people born into it sometimes could not fully feel. On March 16, 1883, Pulitzer launched his campaign in the pages of the New York World, and the way he launched it tells you everything you need to know about his understanding of how to move people. He did not write a polite editorial suggesting that the situation was regrettable and that perhaps those in a position to help might consider doing so. He did not frame the appeal in the language of civic obligation or patriotic duty, the language that had been tried and had accomplished nothing. He wrote with the controlled fury of a man who had decided that shame was a more useful tool than courtesy, and he directed that shame with surgical precision at the exact targets who deserved it. The wealthy of New York, Pulitzer wrote in terms that could not be misread, had failed. The men who had built their fortunes in the most prosperous city in the Western Hemisphere, the men who endowed libraries with their names and attended charity galas and understood perfectly well the relationship between civic generosity and social prestige, had looked at the most symbolically important public monument of the era and had found reasons, one by one, to let someone else pay for it. He named this failure clearly. He described it without softening. He let his readers, the workers and immigrants and ordinary New Yorkers who made up the world's audience, understand that the people who claimed to lead their city had, on this occasion, declined to lead it. But the shame directed at the wealthy was only half of the campaign, and it was the less important half. The more important half was the invitation. Pulitzer turned to his readers and made them an offer that nobody had ever made them in quite these terms before. He told them that the Statue of Liberty did not have to wait for rich men to decide to pay for it. He told them that the pedestal could be funded by the people, pleb of New York, by the people of America, through small donations from an enormous number of ordinary citizens. He told them, and this was the crucial move, the turn that made everything else possible, that every single donation would be published in the pages of the New York World, regardless of its size, every name, every amount. The donation of a child who sent in pennies, saved from a week's allowance, would appear in the same public record as any donation from any other source. This was not merely a fundraising mechanism. It was a statement about democratic participation, and Pulitzer's readers understood it as one. He was telling them that their dollar mattered, that their 50 cents mattered, that their dime, their penny, their whatever you can spare mattered, not as a rounding error in a large fundraising total, not as a token gesture that wealthy donors would someday complete with a serious contribution. Not as a token gesture that wealthy donors would someday complete with a serious contribution, but as a full and equal act of civic investment that would be recorded and published and permanent. He was telling them that this monument, if they chose to fund it, would be theirs, not the property of the wealthy men who had declined to pay for it, not a gift from the establishment to itself. Theirs, the workers and the immigrants and the tenement families, and the ordinary Americans who made the country run while other people claimed the credit. The response was unlike anything American fundraising had produced before. The donations began arriving at the world's offices within days of the first editorial, and they did not stop. They came in envelopes and in person. They came from individuals and from groups. They came from people who had saved specifically to donate, and from people who sent whatever they had in their pockets at the moment. They decided to act. A young girl from a rural town in upstate New York sent 60 cents she had saved over several months. A group of workers at a factory in New Jersey pooled their contributions and sent a collective donation with a note explaining that they had each given what they could. A child sent a dollar bill with a letter in careful handwriting explaining that it was his birthday money, and he wanted the statue to be built. Immigrants, people who had themselves arrived in New York Harbor by ship, who had seen or imagined or hoped for something welcoming in the waters of that harbor, donated with an emotional directness that the published letters in the world conveyed across the decades with undiminished power. The letters Pulitzer published alongside the donations were, in themselves, a kind of literature. They were the literature of ordinary American life in the 1880s. Unpolished, direct, sometimes formally ungrammatical, always completely authentic. They came from people who were not accustomed to addressing themselves to history, and who were doing so anyway because something had made them feel that this moment required it. A German immigrant wrote that he had come to America because of what liberty meant, and that paying toward its monument was the least he could do. A Civil War veteran sent a small amount with a note that the cause of freedom had already cost him more than money, and he was glad to give a little more. A group of school children from Brooklyn sent their combined savings with a teacher's note explaining that they had discussed the statue in class and wanted to be part of building it. Pulitzer published everything: the names, the amounts, the letters when they were included. The daily totals climbed, and the world reported them with the breathless enthusiasm of a publication that understood it was witnessing something historic. The cumulative donation list, published in installments that readers followed the way later generations would follow serial fiction, became itself a kind of monument, a public record of democratic participation that documented, donation by donation, name by name, the identity of the people who had decided that this symbol of freedom was worth paying for. Over 120,000 people donated to the World's campaign. Sit with that number for a moment. 120,000 individual acts of contribution, most of them small, many of them representing a meaningful sacrifice from people who did not have money to spare, all of them accumulating over the course of 5 months into the sum that finally, after a decade of institutional failure, made the pedestal possible. The average donation was considerably less than $1. Some were measured in pennies. The largest individual contributions from ordinary citizens were small by the standards of what a wealthy donor might have written with a single check. But there were 120,000 of them, and together they raised over $100,000 in 5 months. The amount needed to complete the pedestal that years of appeals to the wealthy and to Congress had failed to produce. The achievement was financial, but it was also something else, something harder to quantify and more important to understand. What Pulitzer's campaign produced was not merely money. It produced ownership. It created, across the broad population of New York and beyond, a constituency of people who had a personal, financial, documented stake in this monument, people who had made a choice, however small the dollar amount, to invest themselves in what it represented. The 120,000 donors were not passive recipients of a gift from France. They were builders. They had paid for the ground on which liberty stood. This mattered for reasons that went beyond sentiment. The Statue of Liberty's subsequent meaning. The Statue of Liberty's subsequent meaning, the Dashdow, way it has functioned in American culture as a genuinely popular symbol, rather than an establishment one, the way immigrants have claimed it as specifically theirs, the way ordinary Americans have felt a personal connection to it, that is not merely patriotic abstraction but something more intimate, is rooted in this moment. The statue is emotionally owned by the people who built it, and the people who built it were not the wealthy or the powerful or the institutionally connected. They were the workers and the immigrants and the schoolchildren who responded to Pulitzer's invitation and sent whatever they could afford to a newspaper office in Lower Manhattan because a man who had once been them looked through the pages of his paper and told them that their participation was not optional decoration on someone else's monument but the essential thing, the thing without which the monument could not exist. He was right, and they knew he was right, and they acted on it. There is a particular donation that surfaces in almost every account of Pulitzer's campaign, and it surfaces repeatedly because it carries a weight that larger contributions cannot match. It came from a young boy, somewhere between 8 and 10 years old depending on the source, who sent a single dollar to the world with a letter explaining that he had been saving it for a long time, and that he wanted the statue to be built because his family had come from another country, and the statue was going to be for people like them. The dollar was published in the world like every other donation. The name appeared in the list. The letter was printed. $1. From a child, published beside the names of factory workers and Irish immigrants, and Civil War veterans and Brooklyn schoolgirls, and German newcomers and the thousand varieties of ordinary American life, that the world's donation pages assembled into an aside, now portrait of who, exactly, this country was made of. Pulitzer's campaign closed in August 1885, having raised enough money to complete the pedestal and settle the accounts that the American Committee had accumulated during its long years of insufficient fundraising. The announcement was made in the world with the triumphant simplicity that genuine accomplishment earns. The money had been raised. The pedestal would be finished. The statue would be assembled. Liberty would stand. The editorial Pulitzer wrote to mark the occasion was characteristically direct. He thanked not the institutions that had failed to help, not the wealthy, who had declined to give, not Congress which had refused to fund. He thanked his readers, the ordinary people of New York, the 120,000 contributors whose names filled pages of the world's archives, and whose collective decision to act had accomplished what a decade of establishment appeals had been unable to achieve. He told them what they had done. They had built the base of the most important monument in America. They had funded the ground on which liberty stood. They had demonstrated in the most concrete possible way that a democratic society does not require its wealthy or its powerful to complete the work that its ideals demand. It requires only that enough ordinary people decide, at the same moment, that the thing is worth doing and that their contribution, however small, is worth making. The statue arrived in New York Harbor in June 1885, packed in 214 crates aboard a French naval vessel. The pedestal was not yet finished, but it would be. The money was there, the work resumed, the granite rose, and the iron and copper that Bartholdi and Eiffel had spent years constructing was unpacked on Bedloe's Island and reassembled, piece by piece, in the harbor of the city whose ordinary citizens had decided for $1 at a time that it deserved to stand there. She was dedicated on October 28, 1886, in a ceremony attended by President Grover Cleveland and thousands of spectators, amid the noise of ship horns and cannon fire and the particular American talent for collective celebration that tends to arrive, reliably, after the particular American talent for collective procrastination has been finally overcome. The wealthy men of New York attended the ceremony. Congress sent representatives. The establishment of the city and the country gathered on the island and in the boats surrounding it to witness the unveiling of a monument that their institutions had spent a decade failing to fund. The 120,000 donors were not there in any official capacity. Their names were in the archives of a newspaper. Their money was in the granite beneath the copper feet of the figure who stood, torch raised, above the harbor they had bought her place in. They did not need to be there. They had already done the essential thing. They had built the ground. Everything above it was standing on them. Most people who look at the Statue of Liberty see exactly what they expect to see. A robed woman, a torch, a crown, a tablet. The image is so familiar, so thoroughly embedded in the visual vocabulary of the modern world, that the eye tends to slide over it the way the eye slides over any image it has seen too many times, registering the general shape, confirming that it matches the memory, and moving on without pausing long enough to actually look. Familiarity is the enemy of observation. It tells the brain that it already knows what is there, that the work of seeing has already been done, that there is nothing new to find in something so thoroughly known. But Frederick Auguste Bartholdi was not a man who put things in his work by accident. He was a sculptor who had spent years in Egypt studying monuments built by a civilization that understood, at a level of sophistication most cultures never reach, that every element of a great public image carries meaning, that the angle of a figure's gaze, the position of its hands, the objects it holds or wears or stands upon, are not decorative choices made for aesthetic reasons alone, but a language, a system of coded communication addressed simultaneously to the immediate viewer and to the future, designed to be read by people who know the vocabulary and felt by people who do not. Egyptian colossi did not accidentally hold specific objects in specific hands. The pharaoh did not accidentally stand in a specific posture. Everything was chosen. Everything meant something. Everything was part of a message that the builders intended to survive them. Bartholdi had absorbed this understanding completely. The Statue of Liberty is not a woman holding a torch. It is a text, a carefully constructed, politically serious, historically grounded text, written in the language of symbolic form by a man who had spent 20 years thinking about every element of it, with the assistance of a French intellectual who had spent his career thinking about the relationship between democratic ideals and the symbols that embodied them. Read it carefully enough, and what you find is not a simple celebration of freedom. What you find is an argument, a specific, pointed, layered argument about what liberty is, where it comes from, what it costs, and what it requires of the people who claim to believe in it. Start at the bottom, because the bottom is where Bartholdi placed the most radical element of the entire monument, the detail that speaks most directly and most uncomfortably to the specific historical moment in which the statue was conceived. She is standing on broken chains, not metaphorical chains, not decorative chains rendered in an abstract, aesthetically softened way that allows the viewer to appreciate the artistic gesture without feeling the weight of the specific history the gesture references. Actual chains, heavy, literal, iron-looking chains rendered in copper at full scale, lying broken at her feet, their links snapped, their restraining function permanently destroyed by whatever force moved through this figure and shattered them as she rose. The chains are not visible from the ground. This is one of the most significant design decisions in the entire monument, and it was absolutely intentional. From the ground level, from the perspective of a person standing on the island or approaching by boat, the broken chains cannot be seen. They are hidden by the angle of vision, obscured by the height of the pedestal and the position of the figure's robes. To see them, you would need to be above her, looking down, which in the 19th century was essentially impossible for any ordinary viewer, and even today requires either a specific aerial perspective or a knowledge of their existence that sends you looking at photographs taken from above. Bartholdi put the broken chains there to be in the monument without being of the monument's public face. This was not artistic timidity. It was political intelligence of a sophisticated order, and understanding it requires understanding the specific historical moment of the statue's conception and construction. The idea for the monument was born in 1865, the year the Civil War ended and slavery was legally abolished in the United States. Labalai, who proposed the monument, was a passionate opponent of slavery, who had written about American abolitionism with the urgency of a man who understood that the credibility of democratic ideals depended entirely on whether those ideals applied to all people, or merely to the penitent people who had already been counted as fully human. For him, the end of slavery was not a side note to the meaning of American liberty. It was its most important recent chapter. A monument to liberty that did not acknowledge abolition would be, in his view, a monument built on a deliberate omission. The broken chains are the monument acknowledging abolition, but Bartholdi placed them where they could not be casually seen, and the reason was as practical as it was principled. The statue was being built for an American audience that was deeply, violently divided on the question of race and the meaning of emancipation. The post-Civil War South was in the process of constructing the system of racial terror and legal subjugation that would become Jim Crow. Northern political will to enforce the constitutional amendments that had guaranteed black citizenship was evaporating under the sustained pressure of Southern white resistance and Northern white indifference. The wounds of the war were raw. The politics of race were a minefield that could detonate the entire project if the monument was perceived as a statement about black liberation, rather than liberty in a more abstract, nationally unifying sense. By placing the chains at the base where they could not be seen from the ground, Bartholdi created a monument that contained the truth while managing the politics of that truth with extraordinary care. The chains are there for anyone who knows to look. They are part of the monument's meaning for anyone who understands what they represent, but they do not announce themselves to the casual viewer, do not force a confrontation that the political moment might not survive, do not give opponents of the monument a visible target around which to organize resistance. It was an act of principled compromise, and it is one of the most interesting moral choices in the history of American public art. Rise from the base to the figure herself, and the layers of meaning continue accumulating with a density that rewards sustained attention The robes Bartholdi gave her are not the decorative drapery of a classical goddess chosen for aesthetic reasons alone. They are specifically the robes of a Roman republic, the clothing of civic virtue in the tradition that the American founders had deliberately invoked when they constructed the iconography of the new nation. The founders had been obsessed with the Roman Republic, with its language of civic virtue and public service, and the dangerous tendencies of concentrated power. They had named their upper legislative body the Senate. They had built their government buildings in neoclassical style. They had dressed their symbolic figures in Roman robes. Bartholdi's choice of the same tradition was not historical nostalgia. It was a specific statement connecting the American democratic experiment to its self-proclaimed intellectual ancestors, placing liberty in the lineage of republican virtue that the nation's founders had claimed for themselves. The torch she carries in her raised right hand is the element of the monument most immediately recognizable and most thoroughly discussed. Yet even here the meaning is more specific than it first appears. It is not merely a torch. It is the torch of enlightenment, a symbol with deep roots in the Masonic and Enlightenment traditions that shaped both French Republican thought and the ideological foundations of the American founding. Rabelais was a man steeped in Enlightenment philosophy, in the tradition that held reason and knowledge to be the essential tools of human liberation, that tyranny was sustained by ignorance, and that the spread of education and rational thought was itself a form of political action. The torch is not a weapon. It is not a burning brand meant to destroy. It is a light, specifically the kind of light that makes things visible, that illuminates what darkness has concealed, that allows people to see clearly enough to make the choices that free people make. Enlightenment liberty is not simply the absence of physical constraint. It is the presence of the knowledge and reason that makes self-governance possible. The torch says this. It says that the freedom this figure represents is not merely freedom from tyranny, from oppression, from chains, but freedom to see, to know, to think, to choose. The flame at the top of the torch was gilded to reflect sunlight during the day and was intended to be illuminated at night, functioning as an actual navigational beacon in the harbor. A lighthouse of liberty that served a practical function while simultaneously embodying its symbolic one. That the lighthouse function was never particularly effective is a minor historical irony. The symbol I function has been working without interruption. For nearly 140 years, the crown deserves more attention than it typically receives, because its symbolism is both more universal and more specifically chosen than the casual viewer understands. The 7 rays extending from the crown correspond to the 7 seas and the 7 continents. This was deliberate. The rays do not represent the states of the American Union, as is sometimes suggested. They represent the world, the entire inhabited world. Every ocean and every landmass. Liberty, the crown declares, is not American property. It is not a cultural achievement belonging to one nation, or one tradition, or one set of historical circumstances. It is a human inheritance as universal as the seas that connect the continents and as applicable to every person on every piece of land on the planet as it is to the citizens of the republic where this particular monument happens to stand. This universality was central to Le Boulez's vision from the beginning. He was not interested in building a monument to American exceptionalism. The idea that the United States had discovered or invented or uniquely embodied something that other peoples could not claim. He was interested in building a monument to a principle, to the idea that human beings, as a species, were capable of organizing themselves around justice and reason rather than force and fear, and that this capacity was not the exclusive property of any nation, but the potential inheritance of all of them. The 7-rayed crown places that idea on her head, literally, making it the highest point of the figure and the element most visible against the sky. The rays are also, in their physical form, simultaneously a crown and a halo, a detail that bridges secular and sacred symbolism in a way that was characteristic of the Enlightenment tradition. Le Boulez inhabited. The secular Enlightenment had not, by and large, been interested in the destruction of religious feeling. It had been interested in redirecting that feeling, in transferring the reverence previously given to kings and churches to the idea of human reason and human dignity. The crown that is also a halo performs this transfer visually, suggesting that liberty is both a civic achievement and something approaching a sacred value, worthy of the kind of devotion that human beings have always directed toward the things they consider most important. The tablet in her left hand is the element of the monument, most often reduced to a single fact. July 4, 1776, the date of American independence, and most rarely examined for what that reduction leaves out. The tablet is a book of law, not a proclamation, not a declaration, in the rhetorical sense of a document meant to be read aloud and felt emotionally. A book of law, the kind of bound, codified legal text that a judge or a legislator or a constitutional scholar would hold. This was Le Boulai's specific contribution to the symbolism, and it reflects his professional identity as a legal scholar as directly as any element of the monument. For Le Boulai, liberty without law was not liberty. It was license, the chaos of unconstrained power that was every bit as dangerous as tyranny, because it produced tyranny eventually. The French Revolution, which had begun in the name of liberty, had produced the terror and then Napoleon, and Le Boulai had spent his career thinking about why this had happened and how it could be prevented. His answer was constitutionalism, the binding of power by law, the establishment of institutions that constrained what governments and majorities could do to individuals, the creation of legal structures durable enough to survive the passions of the moment. The Book of Law says that this liberty is not a feeling or a sentiment or a revolutionary cry in the street. It is a legal achievement grounded in written law, protected by institutions, requiring maintenance through the patient and unglamorous work of constitutional governance. The date it bears, July 4th, 1776, marks not a battle won, but a document signed. Liberty, the tablet insists, begins with writing things down and committing to them in the specific binding language of law. Her posture, walking forward, mid-stride, the robes in motion around her, is the most kinetic element of the monument, and the one that most directly contradicts the popular understanding of the statue as a static, permanent, finished thing. She is not standing still. She is moving. Her left foot is raised, the robes swirling around the stride, the figure caught at the moment of forward motion with an energy that no purely decorative colossus would require. This was a deliberate choice, and its meaning is directional. Liberty is not something that has been achieved and can now be rested in. It is something being pursued, an ongoing project, a movement forward into a future that has not yet been secured. The walking figure does not permit the viewer to feel that the work is done. She is moving because the work is not done. She will always be moving, because the work of liberty is never finally completed, only extended and defended and built upon, generation by generation, in the continuous forward motion of people who have decided that the direction she is walking is the direction worth going. Put all of these elements together, the broken chains hidden at the base, the Republican robes, the torch of enlightenment, the universal crown, the book of law bearing the date of a document, the forward stride, and what you have is not a simple celebration of American freedom. What you have is a complex, layered, politically serious argument about what freedom actually is and what it requires. It requires the abolition of slavery, even if that requirement must be stated quietly from a place where not everyone will see it immediately. It requires the light of reason and education, and the freedom of thought that makes genuine self-governance possible. It requires the understanding that no nation owns liberty, and that its principles apply to all people on all continents, and in all seas. It requires law, specific, written, binding law that constrains the powerful as well as the powerless and survives the passions of individual moments. And it requires movement, forward movement, the refusal to believe that what has been achieved is sufficient, the insistence on walking toward more, the embodied acknowledgement that liberty is not a destination arrived at, but a direction committed to. Bartholdi built all of this into a copper figure standing on a granite pedestal in a harbor. He built it so that some of it is immediately visible and some of it requires looking. He built it so that a child seeing her for the first time from a ship feels the simple, overwhelming truth of her presence, and a scholar spending years examining her finds layer after layer of meaning that repays the attention. He built it, finally, to be read differently in different moments of history, to speak to each generation in the specific terms of what liberty means and costs, and requires in that generation's particular circumstances. The broken chains speak differently in 1886 and in 1963, and today. The torch means something different in a world of censored presses and in a world of information abundance. The book of law speaks differently when democratic institutions are secure and when they are threatened. She was built to last, not just physically, though Eiffel's engineering has seen to that, but semantically. Her meaning was designed with the same care as her structure, built to bear the weight of changing times without cracking, to flex under the pressure of new interpretations without losing the integrity of the original form. She is still talking. Most people who look at her see exactly what they expect to see. A robed woman, a torch, a crown, a tablet. But she is saying considerably more than that. She has been saying it, in plain sight, for nearly 140 years. All you have to do is actually look. October 28, 1886, was a day of extraordinary noise. The harbor was full of ships, hundreds of them, their horns sounding in overlapping waves across the water until the sound became less a collection of individual signals and more a kind of weather, an atmospheric condition of celebration that settled over lower Manhattan and the surrounding waters with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of a city that had decided, collectively, to mark this moment as historic. Cannon fire punctuated the horns. Bands played on the decks of vessels circling Bedloe's Island. Confetti and ticker tape fell through the cold October air over Broadway in what some accounts describe as the first ticker tape parade in American history. The paper streaming from the windows of the financial district's buildings in long pale ribbons that caught the harbor wind and drifted over the crowds below. President Grover Cleveland was there. The French ambassador was there. Bartholdi was there, inside the statue itself, holding the rope that would drop the French tricolor, covering her face at the signal from the crowd below. Though the signal came early, or he misread it, and the veil fell before the dedication speech was finished, which produced a roar of premature celebration from the crowd that the orators on the platform had to wait out before continuing. Dignitaries gave speeches. The speeches were long in the way that official speeches at important 19th century ceremonies were always long, full of the rhetorical flourishes and classical references and extended metaphors about light and liberty and the friendship of nations that the occasion seemed to demand. It was, by every conventional measure, a triumph. 21 years after a dinner party in France had produced the original idea, 20 years after Bartholdi had first crossed the Atlantic with nothing but sketches and conviction, 15 years of construction on the French side, a decade of American fundraising failure, followed by 5 months of Pulitzer's campaign producing 120,000 donations from ordinary people, 214 crates crossing the Atlantic, a pedestal built from the pennies and dollars of workers and immigrants and schoolchildren, Eiffel's invisible iron skeleton holding her upright against the harbor wind. And finally, at last, on a cold October morning in 1886, the figure standing complete and unveiled above the water, the torch raised, the crown catching what light the overcast sky allowed, the broken chains invisible at her feet, as they had always been intended to be. She was finished. She was real. She was there. And if you had stood on the deck of one of those celebrating ships that morning and looked only at the surface of the occasion, at the flags and the confetti and the cannon smoke and the faces of the dignitaries and the general jubilant noise of a city celebrating something it had come very close to failing to build, you might have felt, reasonably, that this was a story with a satisfying ending, that the journey from dinner party to dedication had arrived, after all its complications and crises, at a place worth celebrating. But if you looked more carefully, or if you were a particular kind of person standing in a particular relationship to what the statue claimed to represent, the morning of October 28, 1886, contained a different kind of information, a haunting kind, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but settles quietly into the mind once noticed, and cannot be unnoticed afterward. Begin with who was not there. Among the ships in the harbor that morning, circling Bedloe's Island in the general flotilla of celebration, there was one vessel that had organized itself in deliberate and pointed contrast to the official ceremony on the island. It carried a group of women suffragists, members of the New York State Woman Suffragist Association, who had chartered the boat specifically because they had been excluded from the official dedication ceremony. The island itself had been declared, for the purposes of the ceremony, essentially male space. The dignitaries, the officials, the invited guests, were overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, men, and the formal exclusion of women from the ceremony was not an oversight, but a reflection of the social reality of 1886 as clearly as anything else about the day. The women on the boat had brought a banner. They raised it as their vessel circled the island, and they shouted through a megaphone toward the ceremony, and their protest was audible to some of those on shore, and it was noted by some of the journalists covering the event, and then it was largely set aside in the general noise and celebration, and the long speeches about liberty and enlightenment, and the friendship between France and America. The women who organized that protest understood something with precise clarity that the speeches on the island were carefully not saying. The figure being dedicated that morning, this robed female form, this woman with her torch and her crown and her book of law, was a monument to liberty in a country where women could not vote. She was a symbol of democratic participation in a democracy that had specifically and legally excluded half its population from the most basic act of democratic participation. She was holding a tablet dated July 4, 1776, a document that had declared all men created equal, and the word men in that sentence had been interpreted, consistently and deliberately, to mean exactly what it said. The irony was not subtle. It was structural. It was built into the very choice of a female figure to represent a liberty that women were not permitted to exercise in its most fundamental form. There is a school of thought that says this choice was purely conventional, that female allegorical figures for abstract concepts like liberty and justice had a long history in Western art, and that reading political meaning into the gender of an allegorical figure is anachronistic. This argument has some technical validity and misses the point entirely. Whatever the convention, whatever the artistic tradition, the lived reality of 1886 was that the most prominent symbol of American freedom was a woman, and women in America were not free in the specific sense that the symbol claimed to celebrate. The women on the boat in the harbor knew this. They came with their banner because they knew it. A suffragist who spoke through the megaphone that morning was Lily Devereux Blake, and what she said, in the fragments that have survived, was essentially this: that the irony of erecting a female statue of liberty in a land where women were not free was an irony that the occasion demanded be named. She named it. The celebration continued around her. Women would not gain the right to vote in the United States for another 34 years, now moved from the harbor to the country beyond it, because the women on the boat were not the only Americans whose relationship to the dedication ceremony carried the weight of structural contradictio. 9. Frederick Douglass was 70 years old in 1886. He had been born into slavery in Maryland, had escaped, had become the most important Black American voice of the 19th century, had spent his life arguing in the most urgent possible terms that the ideals America claimed as its founding principles applied to Black people as fully as to white people, and had watched, over the decades since emancipation, as the promise of Reconstruction was dismantled, piece by piece, by the organized effort of Southern white resistance and the exhausted indifference of the Northern political establishment. He watched the dedication of the Statue of Liberty from a position of hard-won, clearly articulated disillusion. He had not been invited to participate in the official ceremony. He had not been invited to participate in the official ceremony. He had not been given a speaking role. He had not been asked to lend the moral authority of his biography. A biography that was, in the most literal possible sense, a story about the meaning of liberty and its absence, to an occasion that was centrally concerned with exactly that subject. In the years around the dedication, Douglass wrote and spoke about the statue with a precision that cut through the celebratory noise to the specific, painful truth beneath it. He understood what the broken chains at the base were meant to say, and he understood the gap between what they said and what the country was doing. The broken chains commemorated abolition. The country in which those chains sat broken was actively constructing a system of racial subjugation, the web of laws, customs, economic arrangements, and organized violence that would calcify, in the years immediately following the statue's dedication, into the fully formed architecture of Jim Crow. The year 1886 was not before Jim Crow. It was during its construction. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, which had attempted to guarantee Black Americans equal access to public accommodations, had been struck down by the Supreme Court in 1883, 3 years before the statue's dedication. The decision had been explicit in its reasoning. The 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection under the law, did not prohibit discrimination by private individuals and businesses. Only state discrimination was constitutionally prohibited. The practical effect was to open the door to the systematic private and quasi-private segregation that would define Southern life for the next 80 years. Across the South in 1886, Black Americans were being terrorized into economic and political subjugation through a campaign of violence so sustained and so organized that calling it anything other than a second form of racial control was an act of historical honesty that white America, by and large, was not prepared to perform. Lynching was not a rare aberration. It was a system, a mechanism of political and social control that functioned precisely because it was unpredictable, because any black person could be its victim for any reason or no reason, because the terror it generated was comprehensive rather than targeted. The numbers are not abstractions. In the decades surrounding the statue's dedication, Black Americans were lynched in the United States at a rate of more than one per week. The torch of enlightenment stood in the harbor. The light it cast did not reach everywhere. Douglass understood this with the particular anguish of someone who had believed, at the moment of emancipation, that the promise was real, and had spent the subsequent 2 decades watching the promise be systematically broken. He continued to speak, continued to write, continued to insist on the principles the country claimed to embody. But his tone in the years around the statue's dedication had the quality of a man who has learned to hold hope and grief simultaneously, who will not surrender the ideal but cannot pretend that the reality measures up to it. He died in 1895, 9 years after the dedication. Jim Crow continued for another 70 years after that. These 2 absences, the women excluded from the ceremony, the Black Americans for whom the symbolism was grotesquely incomplete, are not footnotes to the story of the Statue of Liberty. They are essential to understanding what the story actually is, because the story is not simply a story of achievement. It is a story about the distance between ideals and reality, about the specific, painful, recurring human experience of building symbols that exceed the moral condition of the people who build them. This is not an unusual situation in history. It may, in fact, be the usual one. The men who wrote that all men are created equal owned other men. The civilization that produced the philosophical tradition of human rights also produced colonialism. The nation that built a monument to liberty in its most important harbor was, at the moment of that monument's dedication, engaged in the active suppression of the liberty of a significant portion of its own population. These are not accusations designed to invalidate the ideals. They are observations designed to take the ideals seriously, to insist that ideals mean something only insofar as they produce actual changes in actual conditions for actual people, and that the celebration of a symbol is not the same thing as the achievement of what the symbol represents. Bartholdi knew something of this in his way. He was a man from Alsace, a region that had been taken from France by Germany in 1871, and the loss was personal to him in ways that the abstract language of democratic ideals did not fully capture. His homeland was under occupation. The people he had grown up among were living under the governance of a nation that was not their own, speaking a language that was not their primary one, navigating the specific humiliation of a people whose political identity had been overridden by a larger force. He had built a monument to liberty while living at a personal distance from the specific liberty he most wanted, the return of Alsace to France. He understood, perhaps better than Laboulaye's more purely theoretical republicanism allowed, that liberty was not only a philosophical principle, but a physical condition, a daily lived reality that meant something different to people who had lost it than to people who had always had it. The immigrants understood this too. In the years and decades after the dedication, the Statue of Liberty became most powerfully meaningful not to the native-born Americans, whose institutions had built it, but to the people who arrived in New York Harbor from elsewhere, from the pogroms of Eastern Europe, from the famines of Ireland and southern Italy, from the political repressions of a dozen different countries, from all the places where the specific opposite of liberty had been the organizing principle of daily life. For these people, the figure in the harbor was not an abstraction. It was the first thing they saw from the deck of the ship that had carried them across the ocean toward a life they could not yet imagine. And the feeling it produced was not the comfortable patriotism of the established, but the desperate, grateful, complicated hope of the arriving. Emma Lazarus had written her poem 2 years before the dedication. In 1883, as part of a literary auction to raise money for the pedestal fund. The poem, The New Colossus, was not read at the dedication ceremony. It was not inscribed on the pedestal until 1903, 17 years after the statue was unveiled, added quietly and without great ceremony by a group of friends who wanted to memorialize Lazaro, C's, who had died young. For most of its early existence, the most famous words now associated with the statue were not officially associated with it at all. But the poem found its audience anyway, because it said what the immigrants already felt. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The words have been repeated so many times that they risk the same fate as the statue itself, becoming so familiar that they stop being heard. But read them fresh, in the context of the people they were written about, in the context of the Russian Jewish immigrants like Lazarus's own family, the Italian peasants and Irish laborers and Chinese workers and the countless others who came through that harbor with nothing except the hope that the figure in the water meant what she appeared to mean, and the words recover their weight, yearning to breathe free, not already free, yearning for it, approaching it, not yet arrived. This is the most honest description of the statue's meaning that has ever been written, and it was written by a woman, and it was written by a woman, and it was not read at the dedication ceremony, and it was not added to the monument for 17 years. The exclusions are themselves a kind of text. What do we do with all of this? The question is not rhetorical. It is the question that the Statue of Liberty actually asks. If you are willing to hear it, if you are willing to stand in front of the image you have seen 1,000 times, and let it become unfamiliar again, let it become strange and complicated and demanding, in the way that genuinely important things always are when you look at them honestly. She is a monument to an ideal that the people who built her had not yet achieved. She was dedicated in a ceremony from which women were excluded. She stood in a harbor that processed millions of immigrants while those immigrants were subjected to varying degrees of suspicion, restriction, and legal discrimination depending on where they came from and what they looked like. She commemorated the abolition of slavery at her base, while the country built a new architecture of racial subjugation around her. She held the torch of enlightenment above a democracy that was, in 1886, and for many decades afterward, deeply, structurally, violently imperfect. And she still stands. This is the haunting thing, the thing that makes her more interesting and more important than a simple symbol of national achievement could ever be. She is not a monument to something America has finished doing. She is a monument to something America has been attempting to do, imperfectly, inconsistently, with long periods of failure and backsliding, and the organized resistance of people who benefit from liberty remaining scarce. Since before she was built, the women who circled the harbor in their protest boat were part of the monument's meaning, whether the official ceremony acknowledged them or not. Frederick Douglass's disillusionment was part of the monument's meaning. The immigrant children who pressed their faces against the ship railings to see her were part of the monument's meaning. The civil rights marchers who would invoke her image 70 years later were part of the monument's meaning. Every generation that has looked at her and felt the gap between what she promises and what the country delivers has been part of her meaning, because that gap is what the monument was always really about. Lavallee knew the gap. He lived in it. He was a French Republican building a monument to liberty in a country that did not yet fully have it, addressing it to an America that did not yet fully deserve it, sustained by the conviction that ideals exert a genuine gravitational pull on reality, that symbols matter, that stating what you believe in permanent materials creates a pressure toward becoming what you have claimed to be. He may have been right. The pressure is real. The pressure has produced real change, slowly, painfully, incompletely, against sustained resistance. The women got the vote. Legal segregation was dismantled. The immigration that the statue welcomed transformed the country in ways that the people who built it could not have predicted, and some of them would not have chosen. The broken chains at the base have been seen more clearly in some eras than others, but they have never been moved. She is still walking forward. That is the thing about her posture. The mid-stride, the robes in motion, the forward lean of a figure that has not arrived, but is arriving, that earns its place, is the monument's final and most important symbolic statement. She is not a monument to completion. She is a monument to direction. She does not say we have done it. She says this is where we are going. This is what we have committed to. This is the direction we have chosen, even knowing that the distance between here and there is vast, and the walking is hard, and the people who want to stop will always be numerous and loud. She was built by a French intellectual who wanted his country to be different than it was, and a sculptor from an occupied region who understood liberty as absence as well as presence, and a bridge engineer who solved a structural problem nobody had solved before, and a newspaper editor who had once been an immigrant, and 120,000 ordinary people who sent whatever they could afford because they wanted to be part of something that was trying to be true. She was dedicated in a ceremony from which women were excluded, in a country building Jim Crow on the ruins of Reconstruction, in a harbor through which millions of desperate and hopeful people would pass in the decades to come, toward a future hat nobody could fully see. She is still there. The torch is still raised. The chains are still broken at her feet, where those who know to look will always find them. And the dream she represents, the dream that was unfinished in 1886 and has been unfinished in every year since, is still the most important project the country has ever attempted. Still worth the walking, still worth the forward lean into whatever distance remains between where we are and where the torch is pointing. That is not a comfortable ending. It was never meant to be, and that is where we leave her tonight. Not in triumph, not in the clean, finished satisfaction of a story that has resolved itself neatly and delivered you to a comfortable place, but in something truer than that, in the quiet acknowledgement that the most important things human beings have ever built were built not because the builders were certain of success, but because they could not stop themselves from trying. A dinner party became a dream became sketches, sketches became copper and iron became a figure standing in a harbor, still walking forward after nearly 140 years, still holding the light above the water, codpered, and nearly 140 years, still holding the light above the water, still asking the question that great monuments always ask of the people who inherit them. Are you still trying? The answer, on most days, from enough people, has been yes, imperfectly, inconsistently, with failure woven through the effort in ways that honest history cannot ignore. But yes, still walking, still reaching, still building the ground beneath the torch, one small contribution at a time, the way 120,000 ordinary people once built it with whatever they could spare. That is enough to carry into sleep tonight. Let your breathing slow now. Let the harbor sounds fade, the cannon fire, and the ship horns and the noise of a city celebrating something it almost failed to finish. Let the water go still and the torch go quiet, and the October crowds disperse back into the city they came from. She will be there when you wake. She has been there every morning for 140 years, and she will be there tomorrow, facing east into the first light, torch raised above the water, still mid-stride towards something the horizon has not yet revealed. Rest now. You have been carrying enough for one day. Let it all go quiet. Good night.